Coming up next, Sitting at 30 takes you downtown for the weekly luncheon meeting of the City Club of Portland. Live weekly coverage of City Club is produced through the facilities of Portland Cable Access. Now we join the City Club for this week's program.
City Club members. Alan Hart and Ogden Beeman will be awarded special research awards, and Fran Storrs will receive the City Club Award. Following the awards presentations, Mayor Vera Katz will deliver her annual State of the City speech. The program will be held in the ballroom of the Hilton Hotel and will begin at 12 o'clock noon. Please note the change of time and location. For those of you who still may not be aware, the City Club website offers access to research reports, past club program presentations, upcoming events, and membership information. Please check us out at www.pdxcityclub.org. A couple of recent anecdotes illustrate the increasing importance of the web and also serve to reaffirm the value of the City Club of Portland and the work that happens here. The city manager of Mercer Island, Washington, is putting together a program for an upcoming multi-state regional city managers conference and read our 1996 initiative report on the City Club website. Since the initiative process will be a major focus of the conference, he called the City Club office and asked if we could provide him with a speaker. A little farther away in central Ukraine, a former Portlander, now a Peace Corps volunteer, has become very dismayed by the rampant corruption and citizen passivity he encounters on a daily basis. He shared information about the City Club from our website and his host organization in the Ukraine, the Podolian Center of Human Rights, and he has received the go-ahead to establish a city club modeled after the City Club of Portland in the Ukraine. These are but two examples of City Club's ongoing contributions to civic health, locally, nationally, and internationally. And as I'm fond of saying, City Club now more than ever. Our board host today is Carol Witherill. Carol is Professor of Education at Lewis and Clark College and a member of the Board of Governors. And it is her privilege as board host to ask the first question of our speaker. Following Carol's question, as we all know, we will open the program to questions from our audience, City Club members only. Please line up behind the microphone even before Carol has finished her question so that we can entertain as many questions as possible. And remember, we have a 30-second clock on questions. Broadcast of City Club programs this quarter is made possible in part by corporate underwriting from Pacificare, Pope and Talbot Incorporated, and Zimmer Gunzel Frasca Partnership. As always, we are very grateful for their ongoing support. And now to our program. Last October, Langdon Marsh ended his 5-year tenure as director of Oregon's Department of Environmental Quality. And in just a few days, he will be working on the governor's initiative on sustainable communities in Salem. Before accepting his most recent post at DEQ, Marsh served as commissioner of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. Heading DEQ has been called one of the toughest positions in state government. Some days in that job, Langdon Marsh must have felt like an equal opportunity target. Industry, business, elected officials, environmentalists, and the EPA all had him in their sights. During Marsh's term as Oregon's top environmental honcho, DEQ was buffeted by controversial salmon restoration and a Superfund listing for Portland. And although the environment in the Portland metropolitan area is arguably far better than it was a generation ago, significant challenges and threats remain. Langdon Marsh will now share with us his appraisal and forecast of the city's environmental trends and challenges.
Thank you very much, Harriet, for the invitation and to speak here and for the generous introduction. I note that my successor is in the audience, Stephanie Halleck, and I hope that you will welcome her. When New Jersey Governor Christie Whitman, the newly nominated administrator of EPA, was introduced by President-elect Bush a few weeks ago, she quoted one of her and the President-elect's favorite historical figures, Theodore Roosevelt, as follows. I recognize the right and duty of this generation to develop and use the natural resources of our land, but I do not recognize the right to waste them for the generations that come after us. And TR's words remind us that sustainability is not a new concept. In fact, it goes way back in this country to the spiritual and practical wisdom of the Native Americans. We're all familiar with Chief Seattle's understanding that whatever befalls the earth befalls the sons and daughters of the earth. We did not weave the web of life, we are merely a strand in it. And I'd like to spend the next few minutes talking about the web of life here in metropolitan Portland. I'll talk about how we're doing in achieving a sustainable balance between economic and other human activity on the one hand, and the natural systems in which the economy and the quality of our living depend. I want to look at some current trends and conditions in air, water, wastes, and the general health of the ecosystems we are part of. And I also want to try to lay out some of the challenges we face over the next generation and beyond. I also want to put these challenges in the context of what is going on in the Northwest and the rest of the world. And then finally, I want to point to some very positive things that people are doing right now that give us hope that we can meet those challenges in the future. Now, our outgoing president is fond of saying about many things, this is a big deal. And this is very true of what we face here today. We're living in a time of profound change in the worldwide ecosystems, evidenced by things such as global warming, diminished water resources, loss of habitat for species, and the limited capacity of our air, water, and soil to process the amount of nitrogen, toxics, and other wastes that we try to put into them. These worldwide problems, of course, are mirrored here in the Northwest and even in our cities here in the metro area. And we cannot escape responsibility for our part in restoring these ecosystems to a proper balance with our daily lives and our economic pursuits. So how are we doing in the metro area? In trying to answer this question, I've looked at a number of different databases and reports from the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Environmental Quality, from the Oregon Progress Board's excellent report on the state of the environment in Oregon, and from city and metro sources such as the Portland Multnomah Progress Board's excellent benchmarks report. And I have concluded that we are doing better than most urbanized parts of the world, but that we have really a long way to go to achieve a sustainable balance with our natural resources. So I want to review some of the major resource challenges we have to see how I got to this conclusion, with which you may not agree. I want to talk about air and water quality, wastes, and habitat. Let's start with air quality. Generally, air quality is better than it was 10 years ago. It's healthier, and the views that we have of Mount Hood and elsewhere are clearer. The area currently meets all federal air quality standards, with the exception that there was a minor exceedance of the smog standard in 1998. The plans that are currently in place ought to keep us within those air quality standards for the next decade or so, largely because emissions from factories, from vehicles have been tightened in the past, and much more stringent controls put on them. In fact, starting in 2004, there are going to be even more stringent controls on the emissions from trucks and cars, and this is something that the state of Oregon fought very hard for. But even with these new controls, the area will have a continuing challenge to maintain healthy air over the next generation. Obviously, clean air is directly related both to growth in population and the growth in vehicle miles traveled, and both of these are going up pretty rapidly. VMT has increased by 2 million miles per day since 1995 and is expected to grow by another 3 million miles per day by 2010. To put those numbers in perspective, how many miles, a million miles a day do you think people around the Portland area drive? It turns out it's about 23 million miles a day, which is quite a lot. So this will be the region's major air quality challenge over the next generation, but there are certainly others. There's growing concern about toxics such as metals and organics that come from factories, from gasoline and diesel engines, from small businesses like print shops and paint shops, and even from household cleansing products that we find under our sink. These contaminants have largely unknown but potentially disturbing health effects, and we need to make sure that we minimize them to assure that our neighborhoods are healthy places to live in the future. A couple of other issues that we face: small particles from combustion may prove to be a significant challenge, especially as we try to deal with the energy crisis by doing things like making backup diesel generators available for peaking power. And finally, global warming will be a major challenge. Emissions that are related to global warming from all sources are expected to increase by over 20% in this area by 2010. So those are the air quality challenges that I see. Some of the water quality ones are as follows. Water quality has improved significantly over the last generation, but it is still not as good as it ought to be. And there have been monumental efforts over the past 60 years in Portland to try to get them under control. And by and large, sewage and industrial pollution sources are fairly stringently regulated. And massive investments have been made, which started in the McCall era and been driven since then by the Federal Clean Water Act. And they've resulted in the Willamette, for example, being available for boating, fishing, and swimming most of the time, except after combined sewer overflow events. And these overflows, however, are in the process of being corrected, as most people know. The overflows in the Columbia Slough have been corrected as of the end of last year, and they will be eliminated in the Willamette by 2011. I think the city deserves great credit for having stayed on the schedule with these massive and important investments. So as a result of these investments and the work that's been done so far, there's been tremendous improvement in the dissolved oxygen content of the water, and that's very good news for fish. Prior to the 1960s, especially before and during the Second World War, the Willamette was pretty much lethal to most species of fish, and as a result of improvements made since then, fish populations have rebounded and continue to improve even to this day. There are, however, still violations of water quality standards for bacteria, for temperature, and for toxics in the Willamette. And these come from a variety of sources, including, of course, permitted facilities, factories, and sewage treatment plants, like Blue Heron, which was much in the news recently. These facilities have permits to discharge pollutants, and they are facing higher levels of scrutiny by EPA, by DEQ, and by environmental groups. And many of these permittees will have greater burdens in the future to show compliance, both with clean water but also with endangered species laws. And toxics will continue to be a major concern for the Willamette and its tributaries. There aren't good historical data, but we know that the concentration of toxic pollutants in the water and in sediments are higher in Portland than they are elsewhere. Health warnings for mercury limit the consumption of fish caught in the river, and as we saw in the Oregonian a few weeks ago, there are probably going to be additional health warnings for PCBs and possibly others. The toxic sediments which caused the recent federal Superfund listing for Portland Harbor have largely been accumulating there for most of the past century. There has not, I would say parenthetically, been a massive recontamination of the river since the Tom McCall era, as I sometimes hear. Much of that contamination of sediments occurred over the years in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. But it is also true that there undoubtedly has been some additional toxic runoff in the years since the Clean Water Act came into play as a result of growth and urbanization and increasing use of chemicals. We find petroleum products and toxic still making their way into the river from hundreds of outfalls carrying industrial wastes, runoff from streets, commercial lots, and lawns and landscapes. Finally, with respect to water quality, we have some other indicators that show we have a lot of work to do. A number of species of salmonids, steelhead and Chinook, for example, are listed under the Endangered Species Act, and there are documented degraded habitats for fish and other aquatic critters in the Willamette and its tributaries. One piece of good news is that in terms of water availability, water does seem to be pretty abundant in this region, but the State of the Environment report shows that were global warming to have anything like its expected impacts, we could face a dramatic reduction in snowpack over the next 50 years, which would lead to substantial shortages of water in the summer and fall. So that's air quality and water. What about wastes? Let me look first at contaminated sites. Portland has more of these contaminated sites than any other part of the state, at least the Portland area. The three counties of Multnomah, Washington, and Clackamas have over half of the 250 sites on DEQ's inventory. The good news is that a large number of these are being cleaned up, and DEQ estimates that by the end of the next generation, virtually all of the major contaminated sites will be cleaned up. There are going to be, however, lower priority sites with less contamination, many of which are called brownfields, which will take somewhat longer. But the good news is that a lot of the brownfields are being cleaned up for infill housing and other development. And that's partly a benefit of Oregon's land use laws, which tend to drive up the price of and value of inner city contaminated lots and make them more likely to be cleaned up and developed. One of my favorite examples is in Sellwood, the Rose City plating site, which was a highly contaminated small business site, has been cleaned up for multiple use by a combination of a very aggressive developer, Lauren Waxman, and a variety of state and local authorities. And I hope that kind of thing takes off. The yards at Union Station is another good example, a project undertaken by the Portland Development Commission and actually received an award as one of the 10 best brownfield projects in the country. Now, as for the future, the laws controlling the release of hazardous and toxic material make it unlikely that we'll ever see huge sites like McCormick and Baxter on the Willamette and others around Portland Harbor in the future. But toxic contamination is still going to be a threat from thousands of small spills and improper disposal of paints, oils, and pesticides, and solvents in streets, byways, backyards, and lots. On the other part of the waste scale, let's look at solid waste or garbage. The situation there has been much improved, but still needs to be better. In 1991, Oregon set a very lofty goal of achieving a 50% recovery rate or recycling rate for solid waste by 2000. We have not met it. There have been great improvements in recycling since 1991, but statewide the recovery rate has leveled off at about 37%, although here in the metro area it's up to 43%, about 7% short of where we wanted to be. The reason that Metro is doing better is because of aggressive action by the city and by Metro to make recycling easier, if not always fun. The city is the first in the West and probably the most aggressive in the country in requiring recycling of office paper and other material by the commercial sector. But despite this good work, disposal at Arlington and the other big landfills around the state keeps going up. It's increased by over 1 million tons since 1994 to almost 5 million tons today. Now, what's the reason for that? The reason that more stuff is finding its way into landfills, despite the good work we all do on recycling, is that we're buying and using and consuming and disposing of more things. I've given you a number of statistics, probably too many, but the one I hope that you will remember is that the rate at which each person in the state generates waste has climbed from a little over 6 pounds per day in 1994 to nearly 7.5 pounds per day in 1999. That's 7.5 pounds from each one of us every day, and I think we can do better than that. Finally, on habitat, the State of the Environment report documents a significant loss of wetlands in the Willamette Valley over time. It also talks about riparian or streamside areas being in far from ideal condition. We had lost, of course, most of our native vegetative cover, forest cover, in creating Stumptown for reasons that are obvious. We are doing a little better recently. The city, the Unified Sewerage Agency in Washington County, and Metro are doing some very good things to bring back some of the healthy functions of riparian areas. There still are great opportunities, though, for restoring the value of our creeks and rivers and letting nature do as much of the work of reducing flooding, cleaning runoff, and recreating habitat as possible. So that concludes my brief run-through of environmental conditions in the Portland area. Let me summarize by quoting from the State of the Environment report. And they came to a number of conclusions, but 3 of them I think are particularly of interest here in the Portland area. First, they say many of Oregon's key environmental problems are concentrated in the lowlands, and that's like Portland, where most people live and work. Fairly obvious conclusion. The second one, and this is very important for policymakers as well as citizens to remember, the report concludes that our current environmental problems reflect the cumulative effects of many small, diffuse, individual decisions and actions. And I'll come back to that. And the third conclusion is that Oregon's greatest challenge for this century lies in the Willamette Valley. And they say, whether we can improve the ecological health of the valley, measured currently by the recovery of salmon stocks, while continuing economic growth and development for homes and communities, will be a stern environmental test. And I guess the question for us is, can we meet that test? And I'm going to talk a little bit about the hopeful signs that are out there. But before I do, let me briefly say that the problems that I've outlined are no worse here than they are in most other places in the globe. And in some respects, we're better positioned to remedy them. A recent report by Northwest Environment Watch details many of the same themes for the Pacific Northwest as a whole. It shows that population and attendant traffic are increasing rapidly, as if we didn't know, and that species and ecosystems are in trouble in many places. It does find hope, however, in their conclusion that the Pacific Northwest is still a global test case. Less degraded than the rest of the industrial world, it has a better chance at sustainability than perhaps anywhere else. Of course, when you look at the rest of the world, of which we are an increasingly interconnected part, the challenge seems pretty daunting. A recent report of world trends by the World Resources Institute indicates that the consumption of natural resources by the industrial countries continues at a staggering pace. Global energy use is rising about 2% a year, which would translate into about a 50% rise in global emissions over the next 15 years. Global water consumption is also rising quickly, and on and on. There are many other indicators that the World Resources Institute report gives, but you get the picture. Things are not good all over, but we are also connected to the rest of the world by the use of our natural resources and the way we dispose of our wastes. Now, despite this litany of woe on a worldwide scale, WRI, the World Resources Institute, sees hope in the increasing adoption of an ecosystem approach by a growing number of public and private institutions. So I guess let's take a hopeful attitude. I think the alternative is unthinkable. And let's look at where we are here in terms of addressing these issues. In many ways, we're in good shape. We have excellent land use laws, unless they're eviscerated by Measure 7. These land use laws will tend to keep development away from green fields outside the urban areas and away from stream sides. We also have strong air, water, and waste management laws, although as I found out, it's not easy to keep their implementation fully funded, a challenge for each legislative session. Most important, we have a growing network of businesses, public officials, and citizen organizations which are increasingly knowledgeable about the issues and are committed to doing their part to achieve a sustainable future. And there's some really good first steps underway. One of my favorites at DEQ is the Green Permits program, which offers companies some flexibility and recognition for going beyond simple compliance with environmental laws and regulations if they reduce their consumption of natural resources or eliminate waste. LSI Logic is the first company in this area to apply for a green permit. On a smaller scale, and the smaller scale, as I've indicated, is very important, DEQ's Ecologic program recognizes auto shops that adopt best management practices for the prevention of oil and chemicals from getting into the environment. One of my best moments at DEQ was when I was able to walk around the corner from my house and together with Commissioner Dan Saltzman give an award for best management practices to the Hawthorne Auto Clinic. And I expect we'll see more of this beyond compliance behavior as regulatory programs and tax incentives move in this direction, as I'm sure that they will. Another initiative from DEQ is a air toxics program, which will target neighborhoods with particularly high levels of toxic air contaminants. Northwest and Northeast Portland have both been clamoring for this kind of program for a long time. And it's designed to be a comprehensive program to ferret out the sources of air toxics in the neighborhood or affecting the neighborhood and to get at their reduction. And there are many other improvements in the city and surrounding area that are underway. I mentioned the CSOs, the combined sewer overflow cleanup that's happening. That will help address stormwater issues tremendously. The city has also just launched its Green Buildings Initiative, which I think is a very sound way of getting new development to be designed more in harmony with the environment. The Portland Harbor cleanup is about to start, and estimates are that it should be completed within a decade. Beyond that, the public's understanding of environmental issues is also growing. More people are aware of their connections to the environmental problems we face and how they can take action to do something about them. Metro residents, for example, have heeded the call to reduce driving and the use of polluting lawn equipment when DEQ declares a smog alert day. Many landowners do cooperate with efforts to restore degraded stream sides and habitats. There are tools like the Chinook book, which is a wonderful collection of tips on how to reduce waste and problems from both your vehicle, your household, and your lawn and garden. And then it has coupons from businesses that are environmentally responsible. I think you can still get that through Friends of the Trees. And then there's Car Sharing Portland, which offers an alternative to the ownership of a car. All of these and many others are great opportunities for the ordinary citizen to do her or his part. On a larger scale, there are now more plans that are founded on ecosystem principles that will guide our efforts over the next generation. The Oregon Plan for Salmon and Watersheds has been developed in a way to deal with both habitat and water quality and fish issues in a comprehensive way, with success measured by how well the salmon and the ecosystem thrive. The city's Clean Rivers Plan has many elements in it that will lead to a comprehensive solution to the stormwater problem. The city's action plan on global warming recognizes our individual involvement in a really paramount global issue, one we cannot ignore. Another good step is DEQ's leadership group on solid waste just came out with some significant proposals, first to achieve the 50% goal that we missed last year by 2009 through increasing recycling of construction, commercial, and food waste. They also recommended expanding the bottle bill and adopting a really interesting policy of beginning to internalize the cost of management of waste into the cost of production, starting with the industries that produce electronics, carpet, and mercury-containing products. That will bear a lot of watching over the next few years. The governor's executive orders on eliminating persistent toxics over the next 20 years and his order on sustainability over the next generation also, I think, point us firmly in the direction we need to go. One of the most promising efforts is the adoption by some local businesses of the natural step principles, doing business in equitable balance with natural resources. Businesses as diverse as Nike, Norm Thompson, and Rejuvenation Hardware are all trying to figure out how to thrive while lessening their demand on the world's dwindling resources. John Emmerich of Norm Thompson gave a talk here a few weeks ago. And I think he raised what I think will be one of the major issues of the coming century, is how can capitalism evolve rapidly enough to assure that we can live on the planet in a sustainable way. Let me end with a plug for the City Club's own contribution to moving this region forward. Its new report on building a sustainable future for Portland has a wealth of solid information and recommendations for businesses, governments, organizations, and citizens on practical steps that they can take to align themselves better with the needs of our ecosystems. It's on the City Club's website, which Harriet gave you earlier. So it's clear that we're not living in balance with nature as we begin this new century. We must learn ever more wisely how to transform our economy to assure that we achieve that balance while still having good jobs and an excellent quality of life for all our citizens. I believe we have the intelligence and will and courage to do this, and I'm confident that we will do it. The alternative is not acceptable, and I think the future of our area can be and will be bright. Thank you very much.
Thank you. David Orr, author of Ecological Literacy, states that sustainability will require an ethical commitment throughout society. People motivated by a sense that their well-being is linked to that of others and to other life forms. A sustainable globe, and sustainable communities will have to be much more than a technological project or the result of economically rational behavior. How might education and other civic organizations be on the leading edge of this transformation in citizens and corporate thinking.
Thank you. Well, environmental education has had a long history of being either ignored or inadequate in our schools and in adult education opportunities. And I think that one of the lessons of that we're beginning to learn about the paramount concerns of preserving the planet while we continue to thrive economically is that we cannot do it without tremendous amount of citizen involvement. And that, of course, starts with the schools. I've been to schools where, to give awards for recycling, where there's really been a very heartening amount of awareness on the part of the young people about that aspect of living on the planet. But I think that there needs to be a similar kind of outreach and effort throughout all of our educational institutions to get that same level of awareness and excitement and involvement on the part of our young people. I am very encouraged by the degree of commitment that our major universities have toward environmental science and studies. And I think that virtually every college and university in the state has a vibrant program. And somehow we have to translate the excellent learning that we're getting from the science from these institutions into the classrooms of our public educational institutions at the lower level. Thanks.
Hi, Leslie Hildula, City Club member. Since I voted for the other guy, I'm pretty worried about the upcoming administration. And I wondered if you could say anything either to alleviate my fears or maybe reinforce them and tell me where we should be paying attention and focusing our efforts.
Well, I voted for the other guy too. I was somewhat encouraged by the appointment of Governor Whitman as the head of the Environmental Protection Administration, not because she would have been my first candidate for that job, but because of the possible people that could have been appointed. I think she was as good as you could get. And actually, New Jersey has a pretty good record of innovation and trying to do things the right way. They've been looking at some of the work that's gone on in the Netherlands toward green planning and try to incorporate some of that into their programs in New Jersey. I think she has a fairly strong ethic about conservation coming from an outstanding program that New Jersey has for preserving open space. And I think the laws that EPA administers are so strong and are so unlikely to be changed because of the even split in the Congress that anybody coming in there would be hard-pressed to undo them, and I don't think she has the willingness to do that in any case. I'm not as much of an expert on the natural resource side. I'm less encouraged by the direction in the Department of the Interior, though I think you probably still need to keep an open mind as to what will actually happen there. It's of enormous importance to our water quality efforts in this state that the federal agencies, Forest Service, BLM, Fish and Wildlife, National Marine Fisheries Service, all work together with the state agencies and private organizations to restore habitat, to restore water quality on the federal lands as well as on private lands. And I think without a strong partnership with those agencies, we will not see as much progress as we have in the last few years. So that's, I think, something to watch very carefully.
Hello, Shane Jackson, City Club member. In your detail of water and air pollution, you did not mention the impact of motorized recreational water use. Is there anything that DEQ has done to minimize the impact from that source?
Well, motorized pleasure boats are a significant source of pollutants, not a huge source, but certainly one worth worrying about. There are two things that one needs to be concerned about. One is that most outboards and jet skis and so on use two-cycle engines, which only burn about 75% of the fuel that goes through them, and the rest spews out into onto the water. And then they have very bad controls on air emissions. So one of my favorite statistics, I've already given you too many, is that it takes about an hour's worth of operation of a jet ski to produce as much volatile organic compound pollution as it takes a brand new car with the latest controls to emit in 70,000 miles. So they're really inefficient engines. DEQ did a report a couple of years ago about marine pollution and made a number of suggestions. There are some federal regulations that are coming in to make two-cycle engines more efficient so that they won't be as bad polluters. And there are efforts to introduce four-cycle engines more into the new population of outboards. They're more expensive, but they are drastically less polluting. And I think one of the challenges might be, how do you develop incentives to get people to buy those new engines rather than the two-cycle ones?
Candace Guth, City Club member. We've had a very pro-growth state legislature and a business community to the point that most Oregonians feel that population growth has become inevitable. As you move on to the sustainable organization, are you going to consider putting back in the old impact equation that was consumption and technology times population equals impact? Do you think you're going to go back to addressing population in that equation?
I've discovered in years in state government that state agencies or state government as a whole really has very little practical power to do anything about population growth or the economic dispersion of activity. In other words, we would like to see, I think, more economic activity in some of the less populated areas of our state, but the infrastructure and other necessities for that don't always exist. So I have not concentrated much on the population issue in my thinking. I think that part of the way you address it is to get communities to envision their future as to what they want to be and want to become, and then help them, with state programs or federal or private assistance to achieve that vision. And if that vision has a kind of a indication of what size they want to be, then I think that people can help them work toward it. But I don't think there's any simple or set of programs that can deal directly with population.
I'm Ray Polanyi, a City Club member. You mentioned the sizable vehicle mile travel rise, particularly in the metro area, and you also touched upon the Willamette Valley as being one of the crucial elements of the future. This translates into a sizable pressure on urban space, and the issue of sustainability is intrinsically related to automobile growth, and both in the metro area and in the valley. Some of it is due to the lack of alternatives, which means transit in the metro area, which means trains and buses in the valley. They suffer because of lack of funding. What do you think can we expect to redress this lack of funding?
Well, I think that obviously this area has benefited tremendously from some funding. I mean, I think Portland has achieved more mass transit funding than anywhere else in the country. And I think what I was trying to suggest in my remarks is that we are poised to do things better and differently here than perhaps anywhere else. I think that argument needs to continue to be made through our congressional delegation for an adequate level of support for mass transit and intercity transit over the next congressional session and beyond. And I don't know that the politics of mass transit, which Grace Kruniken knows a lot about, are pretty difficult. There are lots of parts of the country that don't like it and would rather see money go to road expansion. So it's not an easy thing to get at, but I think that only the federal government really has the kind of resources to be able to help us, and I think that's where the pressure has to be put.
What about the state level?
Well, the state level budget is really taxed very hard to come up with any new funding for transportation, roads or mass transit, as we saw over the past legislative session and beyond. So unless, and I have not heard anything from Salem so far that indicates that there's likelihood they're going to address that this year.
Steve Shell, member. One of the products of the last century that was worth thinking about, I thought, was Garrett Hardin's tragedy of the Commons and the idea about carrying capacity. And I heard you in your comments talk about kind of the ideas of the 70s, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Resource Conservation Control Act, that kind of thing. But there are some ideas kicking around in government now and elsewhere that mean more to the 90s and into the 21st century. Ideas like maximum daily stream loads, the idea of minimum stream flows, the idea of some kind of limit on global warming gases, such as the Energy Facility Siting Council and the legislature put in for energy plants. Watershed councils and the impact of watershed councils, those kinds of ideas seem to be a little more realistic in terms of trying to think through sustainability at this stage. What's the status of those ideas from your point of view as a former DEQ head and in terms of looking at this sustainability effort?
Yes, well, you're absolutely right. Actually, the Clean Water Act contains a lot of those concepts of maximum daily loads and watershed planning, although they haven't been nearly as explicit as they need to be, and that law needs to be updated. But yes, the Oregon plan for salmon and watersheds is completely dependent on a watershed approach, more of an ecosystem approach to cleaning up the water and restoring salmon habitat. The DEQ has moved significantly away from just concentrating only on permits for so-called point sources, factories and sewage treatment plants, into this maximum daily load concept of figuring out what the waterway can bear and then managing and planning and implementing things that will eventually restore the watershed and look at all of the different sources, whether they're farms or forest or runoff from suburban areas or what have you. So yes, those concepts, I agree with you, are much more lively and much more likely to get us to a sustainable future. But they are implicit in some of the plans that I mentioned. The global warming issue, if you look at the city's action plan, it has some pretty practical steps. One can argue whether they're enough, but they're very ambitious to reduce traffic, to improve mass transit, to reduce combustion of various kinds, in order, and to do it across the board, not just focusing on one sector or the other. So what I was trying to suggest is that these new plans that we're seeing come along are much more ecosystem-based. They are more comprehensive, and they do look toward a holistic solution and not just picking off one party after another.
John Leeper, City Club member. I live in urbanized Washington County. I, however, have friends in agriculture in Washington County. As I talk to them, they now and then, at least, if not more frequently, comment to me that as it applies to chemicals that can be put on the land, there are two standards, one for agriculture, in which they are quite closely monitored as to how much and what it is in the way of chemicals can be put on the land. However, in the urbanized area, there are no such restrictions, and in fact, for urbanized use, there are chemicals that they are prohibited from using. I would like your reaction to those comments, and if in fact there is a double standard, what possibly could be done to in some way curtail urbanized use of these more bothersome chemicals to improve water quality?
Yes, there is a double standard. I think the application rates for chemical fertilizers and pesticides for agriculture are very tightly regulated by the use of the label. And the same chemicals can be used in the backyard with very little similar restriction. What the legislature wrestled with this a little bit last time and came up with a pesticides reporting law. It was designed to try to get some feeling for how much of the pesticides that are getting into our waterways, getting into our waterways in particular, are coming from agriculture as opposed to from our urban and suburban areas. And I think that the jury is still out on that one. Water quality monitoring does pick up measurable amounts of pesticides from agricultural areas in streams. So even though there may be a double standard, it is still a significant concern to reduce as much as possible the use of pesticides and fertilizers in the agricultural areas to do no more than absolutely necessary. In Hood River, for example, we picked up, DEQ picked up some significant levels of pesticides that need to be monitored and remedied. So on the other hand, the point that I made earlier that there's runoff from lawns and landscapes around our city, they clearly do contribute to what gets into the river. I think the answer is we need to address both agricultural and urban pesticide and fertilizer runoff. Irrespective of the equity issue, they're both contributing to water quality problems. I have, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, Dan, let's just do the two top ones from the audience first.
Okay, if you can wait a sec, I'm going to do these written questions. What study might the City Club be best advised to initiate in the environmental area? I thought a little bit about this because the questioner, I think, talked to me beforehand, and the one that came to my mind was look at the issue of incentives. Incentives that come through the property tax or through other taxation, through congestion pricing for our highways, through perhaps recovery of some of the cost of cleanup in the Portland Harbor and elsewhere through tax adjustments. I think there are a lot of different tools that might be used to help reinforce regulation and laws to get to a more sustainable way of doing business. And I think that the City Club is in a pretty good position to be able to study those kinds of things. Next question is, what were DEQ's objections to the Portland's Clean Rivers Plan? Many Portlanders see the plan as a good balance between the need to respond to combined sewer overflows and endangered species requirements. The answer there is DEQ was not, I don't think still is not, opposed to the city's Clean Rivers Plan. All of the elements in it are good things to do. The part that DEQ objected to was the proposal to postpone the cleanup of the Willamette portion of the combined sewer overflow by another 9 or 10 years in order to generate the money to be able to pay for some of the other things in the Clean Rivers Plan and to determine the exact sizing of the pipes that needed to go in on the Willamette side, because you don't want to put bigger pipes in than are absolutely necessary. You want to work with nature as much as possible. I think the solution to it is really like the solution to the intercity transit problem. It's money. And I think there are some opportunities for getting Congress to fund some or the Bonneville Power Administration, which spends billions of dollars, as we heard in the paper the other day, on fish, to fund some of these things that are really good things to do that would accompany the building of the pipes and not delay them and delay the restoration of the river to its use, full use for swimming and boating and fishing. And there's another aspect too which DEQ was concerned about delay, and that is one of the really important parts of the Portland Harbor cleanup plan is to assure that after the cleanup is done, that it won't be recontaminated. And one of the sources of recontamination of toxics potentially, from all these industrial and commercial and lawns and landscapes and so forth that flush into the river, is through outfalls like the combined sewer overflows. So there's a concern that the two plans be as synchronous as possible.
Dan, yours was
Now,
the
Dan.
last question.
I'm patient, I can wait. Dan Godey, member, as you approach your new job of sustainable development, the question you're going to have to face constantly, the conflict between those who define sustained development, as locking up the resource versus those who say, no, develop the resource, but do it in a conservation way to sustain it. We have before us right now, here in the state, the issue over the state forests, where the governor and the State Forestry Board have come down for structure-based management of the state forests, which means development. But certain environmental groups may go to court to stop it. My question to you is, how do you balance, where are you going to come out on this? And what do you see as the future? I'm not talking about the problem of ANWR, of drilling into our wildlife refuges or putting holes in the ground everywhere in the wilderness or anything of the sort. But I am saying that when we lock up the forests, as we've done, and let them burn, let them get overgrown, and then burn, and then destroy the resource, that raises a question of sustainability. Where do you come out on that?
Well, you've raised the question for the next century. I think in every field that we look at, whether it's forestry or whether it's agriculture or whether it's industrial development or urbanization, we have to face this question and answer it for each ecosystem. I think the only way to do that is by, as I suggested, taking an ecosystem approach and looking at, what's the lower Willamette watershed going to need in order to retain and recover some of the healthy functions that it once had. What does the airshed for Portland, Vancouver need? What do the rivers need for salmon recovery? We have to answer each of those questions, and in answering them,